1274 BCE. On the banks of the Orontes River, in what's now northern Syria, the two greatest military powers on earth were about to collide. On one side, the most powerful empire of the ancient world, Pharaonic Egypt, led by a young king determined to prove himself, Ramesses II. On the other, the Hittite Empire, the rising power controlling Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and northern Syria, led by a shrewd and experienced king, Muwatalli II. The result? One of the largest chariot battles in history. Over 5,000 war chariots combined between both sides. But stranger than the battle itself is what happened after it, something that reshaped international relations forever. Because years after this battle, the two sides would sign the first written, recorded peace treaty in the history of humankind. Picture yourself standing where Ramesses stood in that moment, just 20 years old, thousands of enemies closing in, and everything telling you that you've just made a mistake that could cost you your life and your entire army. What does he do? And how did this near massacre, one that almost wiped Egypt off the map, end with both sides sitting at the same table years later? Stay with me. Let's tell this story from the beginning. Picture the map back then. Egypt in the south, the Hittites in the north, and in between, a small region, the Levant, perpetually caught in the same trap. Whose side is it on? Today it belongs to Egypt. Tomorrow it might belong to the Hittites, depending on who's stronger at the time. And Kadesh, specifically, was the key. Whoever held it controlled the entire route. Enter Ramesses, a young man who'd just taken the throne, with everyone around him measuring him against his grandfather and his father, both of whom had already fought on this same soil. Imagine that pressure, being a new king, with everyone waiting to see if you can prove yourself like those before you, or better. In just the 4th year of his reign, he decided to settle it. He would retake Kadesh and cement his name as a warrior king. The problem? The other side was waiting for exactly this moment. Muwatalli, king of the Hittites, knew Egypt was coming, and he was preparing something Ramesses could never have imagined. Ramses's army was split into 4 divisions, each named after a god: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set. Around 20,000 soldiers in total, marching behind him, confident the road ahead was safe. But what Ramesses didn't know was that Muwatalli hadn't just brought his own army. He'd pulled together every ally he could reach, from Anatolia to Syria, until he had over 2,500 war chariots. In simple terms, Ramesses was marching with a quarter of the force he was about to face, fully convinced he was on a stroll. Here's where the real problem began. The Egyptian army was advancing in an extended column, division after division, with large gaps between each one. The Amun division, led by Ramesses himself, was in front. Ra was still far behind, and Ptah and Set were even further back than that. And here came the factor that changed the entire course of the battle. 2 Bedouin men claiming to be deserters from the Hittite army told Ramesses that the Hittites were still far off and too afraid of Egypt to fight. Ramesses believed them, a catastrophic strategic error. The truth was that Muwatalli and his entire army were hidden just a few kilometers away, right behind the city of Kadesh itself, waiting for the right moment. When Ramesses reached his camp and started setting up his tents, real Hittite spies were captured and beaten until they confessed the truth. The entire Hittite army, at full strength, was hiding just steps away from the Amun division. Ramesses realized in that moment that he'd walked into a trap, but it was already too late. Muwatalli wasn't going to let the opportunity slip. He sent a massive force of Hittite war chariots racing across the Orontes River, slamming into the Egyptian Ra division while it was still on the march, completely unprepared, with no battle formation. The Ra division collapsed entirely. The Egyptian soldiers were caught completely off guard and began fleeing in chaos toward the Amun camp, with Hittite chariots right on their heels. The result? The enemy was now bearing down on Ramesses' own camp, and the Amun division, the only force anywhere nearby, was itself being blindsided, with no support from the other 3 divisions. In this moment, the Egyptian position was on the verge of total collapse. The Hittite army had broken into Ramesses' camp, and chaos took over. The king himself was now surrounded. No Ra division to protect him, no Ptah or Set division had arrived yet. Just Ramesses, his guard, and thousands of enemies closing in. This is the part the Egyptian inscriptions tell with tremendous pride. And of course, we need to remember these accounts were written entirely from an Egyptian point of view, with obvious exaggeration as part of royal propaganda. According to the inscriptions, Ramesses, surrounded and nearly alone among thousands of enemies, refused to flee, and instead led a personal countercharge from his war chariot, backed only by his personal guard and the remnants of the Amun division. The inscriptions describe him calling on the god Amun for help, fighting almost single-handedly against wave after wave of Hittite chariots, and turning the tide of the battle through sheer personal courage. The historical reality is likely simpler. After the initial breakthrough, the Hittite formation fell into disorder as it began looting the Egyptian camp instead of pressing a coordinated attack. And that gave Ramesses and the remaining Amun forces the chance to regroup and hold off the follow-up assaults. On top of that, unexpected reinforcements reached Egypt, an elite force known as the Ne'arin, likely arriving from the Phoenician coast, entering the battle at exactly the critical moment and helping repel the Hittite assault. As evening approached, the Egyptian Ptah division finally arrived at the battlefield, tipping the balance somewhat in Egypt's favor for the final hours of the day. The first day of battle ended without a clear decision. Egypt had survived what could have been total disaster, but it hadn't won a crushing victory either. The Hittites, for their part, had failed to destroy the Egyptian army completely, even though they'd come within a hair's breadth of doing exactly that. On the second day, there were further skirmishes, but neither side achieved a decisive win. The practical outcome? A military stalemate, and Kadesh itself remained under Hittite influence. Here's where things get really interesting. When Ramesses returned to Egypt, he ordered the battle carved into the walls of massive temples, Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, Karnak, describing it as a crushing personal victory, and completely omitting the fact that the campaign had failed to retake Kadesh. On the Hittite side, Mu'attali also claimed victory, since he'd kept Kadesh under his control and had come close to destroying the Egyptian army entirely. So both sides claimed to have won. It's a textbook example of how history gets written from the winner's perspective, or at least from the perspective of whoever likes to call themselves the winner. About 15 years after the battle, worn down by continuous conflict and facing a shared new threat from a rising power, the Assyrians, Ramesses II and Mu'attali's successor, his brother Hattusili III, agreed to sign a formal peace treaty. This treaty is known as the Treaty of Kadesh, or the Eternal Peace Treaty. It was written in two versions, an Egyptian copy in hieroglyphics at the Karnak temple, and a Hittite copy in Akkadian cuneiform on a silver tablet. This wasn't just a ceasefire, it's the first written, preserved diplomatic document in human history, and it included mutual non-aggression between the two states, a mutual defense pact against any third-party enemy, extradition of political refugees between both sides, even clauses protecting the rights of extradited families. This treaty is so significant that a copy of it hangs to this day at the United Nations headquarters in New York as a symbol of the oldest documented peace agreement in human history. Think about that for a second. Ramesses, the same man who carved into temple walls that he'd fought alone and single-handedly won the battle, is the same man who, 15 years later, reached out to his old enemy and signed a peace. A king whose entire image was built on being the warrior who cannot be defeated realized at some point that there was something more important than winning: surviving. That's what makes Kadesh different from any other battle in the ancient world, not because it was the largest chariot battle in history, but because what came out of it, in the end, was a peace treaty, not a victory. And that was the first topic in our new series on history's most famous battles. Next episode, we're heading somewhere completely different. So if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us keep the series going.